All right, we are ready for chapters 21 and 22. Dominic was too stunned to talk. As he leaned forward to have a closer look, he saw the initials SC scratched on the key. They were scratched in just the same way as the ones on his own lucky key. Before he could say anything, the Senora hurried them out of the room, whispering that Salvador needed his rest. Dominic and Antonio followed Francisco as he carried Violeta up the wooden ladder to the attic. That was where Senora Galisteo had laid down feather beds on the floorboards for them. All the while, Dominic stood clutching his bare neck, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Francisco, he finally whispered. Where'd Salvador get that key that he's wearing around his neck? Francisco shrugged. I don't know, I found it last year in a churchyard. He keeps hoping that it's a pirate's key and it'll open buried treasure, and that one day he'll find the treasure chest and the key will open it. What about the initials? Initials? On the key, Dominic exclaimed. The initials, SC, how'd they get there? His voice had risen to a cry. Calm down. It's just an old key. Just tell me about the initials, Dominic pleaded. He scratched his own initials in the key, with Father Tomasillo's pin, Antonio explained. The one he uses for the altar cloth? But don't tell Father Tomasillo. SC, Dominic whispered. Salvador Candino. Who else would it be? Francisco replied. That night, Dominic stayed awake long after the others had fallen asleep. He was thinking about his own father's name, Sal. He had never thought that it might be short for something. Salvador, say? And what would it mean if his father and Salvador had the same first name? There was so much that he didn't understand. And how did he get Salvador's key? How did the key get here in the first place? And who was the old man on the phone in the museum? And now there was no time left to figure it all out before the boys left for America. Chapter 22. In the middle of the night, Dominic and Francisco were suddenly awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps on the ladder leading to the loft where they slept. Francisco, come, Father Tomasillo whispered in the darkness as they light from the lamp that he lit his worried face. It's Salvador. He's worse. They quickly awakened Antonio, and the three hurried down the ladder. They found Salvador laying in the bed, groaning and doubled over with pain, chalky white and drenched with sweat. He didn't even notice that they had entered the room. Senora Galisteo sat by his side, softly praying the rosary beads. Take the little one out to the courtyard for a drink, Senora Galisteo whispered to her husband as she guided them back into the hallway. Antonio began to protest as he wanted to say, but the sadness in the old woman's eyes quieted him in one glance and then he hurried after Senora Galisteo. What is it, Senora? Francisco whispered. He'll be well enough to travel by morning, won't he? The old woman shook her head. But the saints' relics, they'll bring down a fever. Salvador will get better. He has to get better today, insisted Francisco, clutching her arm. He's very sick, she whispered. The fever's too high. Salvador has said his prayers and received his last rites, Father Tomasillo whispered, placing a hand on Francisco's shoulder. No, Father, Francisco cried. Don't say that. He's going to get well. He has to get well. He has to go to America so he can be a cowboy. His words trailed off into a sob. You must be strong, Francisco, for Antonio, urged Father Tomasillo. Go to him now. He would want you beside him. Francisco followed Father Tomasillo to the bed. Dominic stared from the doorway, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. How could Salvador, who was strong and alive, be dying from a simple stomach ache? Salvador was too young to die. It wasn't possible. It wasn't fair. Can't you call an ambulance? Dominic asked. Senora Galisteo looked puzzled at Dominic, and he realized that there probably was no such thing around. What about a hospital? Isn't there a hospital you can take him to? The old woman sighed. The malaria has killed so many there. He's better off here. Francisco looked at Dominic, his eyes heavy with sadness. He's asking for you, Francisco said. Dominic walked to Salvador's bedside, where he found Salvador laying, his eyes half closed. His face was flushed with fever, and his forehead beaded with sweat. Francisco gently laid his hand on his brother's cheek and whispered into his ear. Hey, cowboy, what are you doing just laying there? You need to get up and practice your roping tricks. Salvador grimaced. Francisco, I'm afraid, he said. Dominic could see the pain in his eyes as he struggled to speak. Don't be afraid, Salvador, Francisco said firmly. You'll get better. You will. And we'll get to go on the boat tomorrow to America, I promise. Salvador closed his eyes and shook his head. That's not what I'm worried about. I'm I'm so afraid. Don't worry, Dominic tried to assure him. You're going to get well and be a cowboy in America. No, it's not that, Salvador sighed. Come closer. Dominic leaned over the bed with his ear to Salvador's pale lips. It's horses, Salvador gasped. Horses? Yeah, horses. I'm afraid of horses, Salvador admitted in a weak whisper. We never could afford one, and I've never been able to ride a full-size horse. How can I be a cowboy if I'm afraid of my own horse? Salvador groaned, but his eyes were fixed on Dominic. Well, Dominic hesitated, trying desperately to comfort his friend. I don't think you have to worry too much about that. No? Salvador whispered. No, Dominic told him, because I think once a cowboy meets his horse, it's like meeting your best friend. You recognize one another right away, and you just know what to do. I really hope he recognizes me, Salvador said, struggling to get the words out. The pain overtook him and he groaned loudly. He will, Dominic assured him. You'll be a great cowboy, with a great horse, and your lucky buffalo nickel. Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out his nickel. He felt sorry he hadn't given it to Salvador sooner. Dominic pressed it into his palm. Now, as a faint smile crept over Salvador's face and his eyes began to close. That's right, you get some rest, Dominic whispered. You're going to be a cowboy, and you've got to get plenty of sleep. Francisco, Salvador called to his brother. Do you hear? Francisco leaned over the bed. Hear? What do you hear? The bells, Salvador whispered. His eyes closed. Don't you hear the bells? Salvador gave out one final gasp. His eyes flashed open for a second and then quickly closed. Salvador! Francisco cried. Please don't go! He lowered his head into his brother's chest and began to sob. Dominic stood staring at the old buffalo nickel that had fallen from Salvador's limp hand onto the faded feather bed. Can you hear me, Salvador? Open your eyes! Please open your eyes! Francisco begged. Violeta nuzzled her way into the lap to comfort him. Oh, my sweet Senora Galsdale whispered, placing a hand on Francisco's shoulder. He no longer hears. Dominic closed his eyes tight, fighting back the cry that was building up inside of him. And as he listened to Francisco's muffled sobs and Senora Galsdale's whispered prayers, he suddenly heard a melody coming from out in the courtyard. Dominic realized the tune at once. A tear rolled down his cheek as he heard Antonio playing the beginning of Home on the Range. Tomorrow we will read chapter 23.